Get out of here.
Yeah, go on.
The clink of a silver scoop seemed to echo in the suddenly still room as a man's laugh cut sharp, mocking the worn coveralls of the woman seated by the window so everyone could hear. Eve Harper, 55, a quiet town mechanic, moved with practiced composure, her fingers brushing against the polished wood of the silver coffee scoop as steam rose from mugs and the bell above the door gave one last tired jingle. Outside, flags left from the Veterans Day parade sagged in the damp air, while inside the smell of bacon and burnt coffee lingered as neighbors shifted uneasily, pretending not to watch. The laughter hung in the air, heavier than smoke, pulling every gaze to the corner where Eve sat, her wallet resting near the napkin dispenser, its edges soft from years of use. Have you ever noticed the way a whole room can hold its breath, waiting for someone to decide whether silence will keep the peace, or whether the truth deserves to be spoken aloud? The harbor air carried salt and wood smoke as Eve Harper slid into her usual booth at the Seabrook Diner Oldies, crackling from the radio above the counter. June met her halfway with a coffee pot balanced on 3 fingers, the way she'd done for decades. "Cold one," she said, breath fogging as the bell above the door tinkled shut. She topped off Eve's mug before Eve could nod, set down a saucer with a packet of sugar, even though Eve took it black, then tucked a loose strand of gray hair behind her ear and moved on to the fishermen clustered at the counter. It was early November, the week when flags still hung from porch rails after the Veterans Day parade, and the town smelled of damp leaves and last night's rain. Beyond the windows, the harbor lay flat as slate. Eve slid her wallet from the front pocket of her coveralls, the leather soft with years of use. When she opened it, a slip of yellowed paper poked out just a corner feathered at the edge, like it had been torn and handled too much. She pushed it back with her thumb without looking at it the way you smooth a photograph you've memorized, and set the wallet near the napkin dispenser. On the radio, a DJ with a voice like warm gravel introduced a song that had topped charts the year Eve learned to pack wheel bearings by feel. At a booth against the far wall, 2 men in watch caps discussed the coat drive at the Civic Center. "They say the box is half full already," one said. "Half empty," the other corrected with a wink, and both chuckled. A hand-lettered flyer curled at the diner's bulletin board. "Coat drive this week" taped beside a church potluck announcement and a photo of last winter's record striper catch. The bell rang again. A man hovered in the doorway, hesitant. He wore a watch cap like the others, but his coat was too thin for the weather, and his beard looked grown in self-defense rather than style. Ray Donovan. Around Seabrook, he was known the way a lighthouse is known, always their usually silent a fixed point you registered without naming. He carried a canvas duffel with a broken zipper that he held closed with a bit of braided cord. Ray took a step toward an empty stool at the counter. Before he could sit, a security guard appeared outside the plate-glass, broad-shouldered, shiny jacket, with security angled in white across the chest, a lanyard bouncing at his sternum as he strode past in that quick, officious way some men walk when they've been given a badge. He paused at the window, spotted Ray through the glass, and smirked. He tapped the glass twice and pointed his thumb toward the Civic Center up the street. The gesture looked casual. The tone didn't. "Hey!" the guard called when the door cracked open and Ray slipped in on a gust of cold. "You don't belong here. Civic Center's not a warming hut." The diner fell into that peculiar silence that has sound in it, the sizzle from the grill, the scrape of a plate, someone clearing a throat. June looked up sharply. The fisherman went still. Eve felt something like a small door close somewhere behind her ribs. Ray didn't argue. He'd learned years ago that argument only gave someone a ladder to climb higher on their own meanness. He lifted his duffel higher on his shoulder and stepped back toward the door, eyes cast down as if studying the floor's checkerboard tiles might reveal a new route through a familiar morning. "Hold on," June said, moving with the pot still in her hand. "Coffee's $1 when the wind's from the north." She said it lightly, almost like a joke, but she had already reached for a clean mug. The guard shifted in the doorway, half in, half out, like a man arguing with his reflection. Eve's gaze drifted to the wallet near her saucer. She could feel the paper's presence, the way you can feel the missing tooth of a gear a hitch where smooth should be. She didn't take the wallet. She lifted her mug instead and sipped, letting the heat sit on her tongue until it was almost pain and then not. "Ma'am, the guard said to June policy's policy." His voice was louder now, carrying for the benefit of passers-by on Harbor Road. "We've got rules for a reason." "Rules and reasons," June said, still soft. "Imagine that." She poured a measure of coffee anyway, set the mug near the counter's corner where Ray could reach it if he dared. Her eyes met his for a heartbeat. They were steady eyes, the kind that had watched storms come and go and set out pie regardless. The men in watch caps resumed their low conversation, pointedly ordinary, as if refusing to let the moment grow legs. A woman near the window folded her newspaper slower than before. In the corner, the old pinball machine woke with a blip and then went back to sleep. Eve's plate arrived eggs over easy toast buttered to the edges, and she ate without tasting much. The garage opened at 8. She could fix a seized caliper by ear, could tell a warped rotor by the shimmer a wheel sent down Main Street, could thread her hand between hot exhaust and frame rail and come away with skin unburned. The town trusted her with metal and motion. Trust was not the same as belief. Outside, the guard had moved on, but his laughter hung in the doorway like a draft. Ray stood with his palm pressed to the glass, as if deciding whether the warmth inside belonged to him. Then he drew his hand back, shouldered the duffel again, and stepped into the wind. June set a slice of pumpkin pie beside Eve's plate unasked. "Test batch," she said. "Too much clove." "It's perfect," Eve said, and meant the gesture more than the spice. She slid a couple of bills beneath the saucer, $1 extra for the pie, another for the coffee Ray hadn't had. The yellowed paper in her wallet shifted as she closed it, a whisper against leather. It had waited there a long time, surviving summers of humidity and winters of dry heat. It knew patience better than she did. At the counter, the fisherman began talking about the parade again, how the high school band had held its line despite the cold, how the color guards' gloves had matched their smiles, small talk that made a shelter over the tabletops. Someone mentioned the coat drive and how the civic center box was already half full. Half empty, the other said, and they laughed again, not unkind. Eve's eyes went to the bulletin board by habit. On the potluck notice, Pastor Ruth's neat handwriting had added a line since yesterday, "Bring a friend who might need a meal." In the corner, someone had tacked up a snapshot of a young sailor with a penciled year on the back. The photograph had a crease down the middle like it had been carried in a wallet longer than it had spent on a shelf. She gathered her things. The bell chimed as she stood. The bell chimed when she sat. On cold mornings in Seabrook, bells did a lot of honest work. June leaned in to refill the mug, though it was already full. "You heading to the garage?" "Yeah," Eve said. "Watch your step. That backlot puddles a skating rink." "I will." June glanced at the wallet once more. The way you look at a closed toolbox and know the right wrenches inside if only you'd open it. She didn't ask. Eve didn't offer. A gust shoved the door when Eve pushed it. The smell of the harbor met her, the iron of wet rails, the faint iodine of rockweed exposed by the tide. Harbor Road was waking trucks coughing to life, a delivery van nosing into the alley by the diner, a gull standing on one leg on the lamppost like a bored sentry. Up the street, the Civic Center's glass front shone pale, and a cardboard box just inside the doors held a small mountain of coats with a handwritten sign taped crookedly to it. Ray was already halfway up the block, head down against the wind. The guard, now farther along his patrol, cut a sharp line across the pavement. Eve watched them diverge, one path with a badge, one with a duffel, and a spine that had learned the shape of weather. She tucked the wallet deeper into her pocket and felt the paper press back the way a kept promise sometimes does, light insistent. Eve grips her wallet tighter, wondering how long she can keep hiding her own past. The harbor air carried salt and wood smoke as Eve Harper slid into her usual booth at the Seabrook Diner Oldies, crackling from the radio above the counter. June met her with the coffee pot already tipped the way you pour for someone whose mornings you've counted in cups. "Wind's turned," she said, steam lifting between them. "Supposed to spit sleet by afternoon." She set the mug on its saucer without a clatter, then laid a paper napkin just so, like a small kindness folded into a square. Flags from Saturday's parade still hung along Main, their edges a little wet and heavy from the night's rain. Through the window, the harbor lay the color of a pewter plate gulls, bowing to the gusts as if in prayer. The bell over the door gave its tinny greeting for a pair of fishermen coming off the dock boots, squeaking hands raw and happy. On the bulletin board by the register, a hand-lettered sign announced, "Coat drive this week," in a steady church lady hand. Eve pulled her wallet from the front pocket of her coveralls. The leather was thin at the fold, the same way a well-used wrench grows smooth where fingers have trained it. When she opened it, a slip of yellowed paper peeked out from behind a credit card, a soft corner feathered from years of being put away. June's eye caught it, then flicked back to Eve's face as if to say, "I saw something, and I won't say I did." Eve nudged the paper flush with her thumb and set the wallet by the napkin dispenser, smooth and casual. She ordered eggs and toast, and the kitchen sang its short song spatula plate bell. The smell of bacon drifted through the room, and the Oldies station eased into a chorus that had lived on the town's airwaves since prom nights that now sat in frames. The men at the counter warmed their hands on mugs and talked about the Civic Center's coat box. "Half full by noon yesterday," one said. "Half empty this morning," the other said, not to be dour, but to make room for more. Eve listened with half an ear, the way a mechanic listens for bearings you learn the difference between ordinary hum and a sound that predicts trouble. The town's talk had a music to it, years of choosing kindness where it could. Still, a wrong note now and then could cut. The bell chimed again. A man paused in the doorway, uncertain whether the warmth inside belonged to him. Ray Donovan wore a watch cap like the fisherman, but his coat's lining had given up long ago, and the cuffs were frayed to fringe. He held a canvas duffel closed with a loop of braided twine. He had the look of someone who didn't need a mirror to know his face, only a place to sit where no one would ask him to explain it. He made 2 steps toward a stool. From up the street, a security guard strode past the big front window on his patrol jacket, shiny letters blocky and white across his chest. He backtracked, caught sight of Ray through the glass, and tapped twice on the pane with a knuckle. The sound came thin into the diner, a hollow coin on a counter. He yanked the door open enough to put his voice inside. "Hey, pal. Civic Center isn't a warming hut." He said it with a cheerfulness that made it sharp. Forks paused halfway to mouths. One of the fishermen took a sip of coffee he didn't need. June, still holding the pot, turned slightly, her jaw easy but her eyes not. Ray didn't argue. He never seemed to. He stepped back like a man remembering an old step he didn't like, shoulder hitching his bag higher. The guard's laugh caught on the door jamb as he moved on a scrap of sound that stuck to the wood. June slid a clean mug toward the corner of the counter. "North wind," she said to the room more than to anyone. "Coffee's $1 when the wind's from the north." She poured a black ribbon into the empty cup and left it there unclaimed but waiting. Eve's plate arrived. The yolks were the pale gold of weak sun. She buttered her toast to the edges and took a bite that tasted mostly of salt from the air and a tiredness she hadn't named. She could fix a groan in a suspension by feel. She could hear the difference between a tire that wanted air and a wheel bearing that wanted mercy. The town trusted her with the quiet arithmetic of safety torque. Here pressure, there a checklist made of hands and habit. Trust and belief weren't the same, she knew. Belief took longer. Ray eased the door wider and slipped inside just enough to hold his palms to the warmth. He stood by the glass eyes on the harbor like a man reading an old letter. The fisherman found something fascinating in the donut case. June polished an already clean spot on the counter, then set a small saucer beside the waiting mug as if that might give the cup permission to be needed. Supposed to be a big turnout for the coat drive, one of the men called over, not looking at Ray, but not addressing him either. "Got a parka in my truck I'm bringing by after lunch." Ray nodded once, a small kindness given back. The DJ on the radio cut in between songs, voice warm and amused. "Bundle up out there, Seabrook," he said. "And if you see Ms. June today, tip big, she remembers." Laughter ran soft around the room. June rolled her eyes at the ceiling like the station could see her and poured Eve a refill. "Thanks," Eve said. "You headed to the garage?" June asked, wiping a ring of coffee from the table as if erasing a small worry. "Soon as I'm done." Eve tried to smile and felt how it caught on something. "You need anything looked at? That mixer of yours sounded rough last week." "Bless you, it did, and then it stopped sounding like anything." June tilted her head toward the kitchen. "I'll trade you a pie for a diagnosis." "You'll get the diagnosis either way," Eve said, which made June's mouth do its kindest curve. Outside, the wind changed its mind and came hard across Harbor Road. The door shivered. The security guard's jacket flashed again through the window, that white word cutting the gray. Eve reached for her wallet. The yellowed corner reappeared at the fold. The paper had a softness that came only from time and being kept. She pressed it down with her thumb, then tucked 2 bills under the saucer, 1 extra for the man who might drink the cup at the counter when his courage looked like need. She took in the room the way you memorize a face before a long trip. June's careful hair, the fisherman's chapped knuckles, the bulletin board's crowd of tape and thumbtacks. On the potluck flyer, a neat line had been added in blue ink. "Bring a friend who might need a meal." Pastor Ruth's handwriting looked like a path laid gently over snow. Ray moved for the door again, shoulders rounded against the weather and whatever else waited outside. The guard's laughter, smaller now for distance, still seemed to cling in the doorway. Someone breathed out, and the diner took that breath and made it ordinary plates, sips the scrape of a chair. Eve stood the bell giving its faithful chime. June topped off the mug, though it didn't need topping. "Careful out there," she said. "That puddle in the back lot froze slick." "I'll watch it." June's eyes slid once more to the wallet, not prying, just noticing. It was the kind of looking that built towns seeing a thing and letting the seeing be enough for now. Eve buttoned her jacket and pushed into the wind. The harbor smell met her iron and salt and the faint iodine of exposed rockweed. Ray's back was already halfway up the block, the canvas duffel bouncing lightly at his hip. A truck rattled past with a bundle of donated coats in the bed cuffs fluttering like flags. She headed toward the garage boots clicking on the curb and felt for the shape of the wallet in her pocket for the thin insistence of the paper within it. Eve grips her wallet tighter, wondering how long she can keep hiding her own past. By mid-morning, word spread that Gerald Blake, the insurance man from Portland, was coming down with new rules. The news carried through Seabrook like the wind off the harbor, swift and unwelcome. On the Civic Center steps where flags from Veterans Day still flapped. Blake stood in his neat gray coat, a folder pressed to his side. His assistant hovered behind with a clipboard, eyes bright with borrowed importance. "Every facility must comply with our updated standards." Blake declared, his voice clipped. No exceptions for legacy operations. Eve Harper lingered at the bottom step, her coveralls still smudged from the morning's brake job. Blake's gaze slid across her, pausing just long enough to make the point. In particular, he went on garages with inconsistent records. Old habits can be dangerous. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Eve touched the bulge in her front pocket where her wallet rested, tucking it firmly back as if the motion could bury more than bills. Across the street, June, carrying a bakery bag, caught the gesture and gave her a look that was both question and comfort. Blake closed his folder. Council will convene later this month to decide whether your garage remains under policy or passes to a contractor. Until then, adhere to the interim checklist. His smile was practiced like a salesman closing a deal. The town manager nodded, the assistant scribbled, and Blake stepped off the stairs, already turning to his phone. Eve let out a breath she hadn't meant to hold. She turned toward St. Luke's, where the choir was practicing with the doors open. Pastor Ruth stood outside, cardigan buttoned high, a clipboard under her arm. "Walk with me," she said when Eve approached. "If I don't hide a minute, they'll draft me for tenor." A flat note carried out of the hall. Ruth grinned. "Proof?" Eve managed to smile. "Blake," Ruth asked. "Blake." Ruth's eyes softened. "You'll need your voice soon. Doesn't have to be loud, just yours. I'm better with wrenches than microphones." "Wrenches have sermons too," Ruth replied. Out back, the church van sagged with its hood up. "Alternator's sulking again," Ruth said. "I'll check it." Eve fetched her kit from the garage. Her hands knew the route across the engine like a hymn. Belt battery bracket. She spotted the cracked ear of the alternator and braced it with flat stock and bolts, an old trick but steady enough. The engine smoothed into a contented hum. "Listen to that," Ruth said. "They'll sing better knowing the van starts." Eve wiped her hands, grateful for a problem that yielded to touch. Inside, the choir stumbled through their big note. Children giggled in the corner. The room smelled of floor wax and casseroles waiting for potluck. The laughter was a quilt laid over the morning's chill. Later at the garage, the air smelled of oil and cold metal. Eve bled the brakes on the town bus, checked a line, set an order form aside for alternator parts. She worked quietly, the sound of tools clicking like punctuation in a private language. The door opened. Blake stepped in, scanning the pegboard and clipboards like a man evaluating antiques. "Council meets the third Tuesday," he said without greeting. He laid a sheet of requirements on the counter. "Be prepared. Verbal assurances won't suffice." Eve met his gaze briefly, then looked past him toward the church hall where music still carried on the air. She didn't argue. Not yet. Blake left the smell of paper and aftershave fading behind him. Quiet returned the language of cooling metal and ticking clocks. At dusk, she tested the church van one more time. The engine caught smoothly. Ruth stood at the door handing out sheet music, joking with the altos about mercy notes. Children laughed. Women compared pie crusts. Someone pinned a new flyer about Thanksgiving on the bulletin board. Eve locked the garage. She slipped her wallet from her coveralls to slide in an invoice. The leather sighed as it closed. She pressed it flat with her palm, sealing it as if against the world. Across the street, Blake stood under a lamp phone to his ear, confident as ever. Eve wiped grease on her coveralls, pressing the wallet closed in her pocket as if sealing away the only defense she has left. Down in the library basement, dust rose as Tom Alvarez slid a box of ledgers across the oak table. The room ran warm despite November, the radiator ticking like a metronome set a little fast. Paper smelled the way old rooms remember glue ink, a trace of camphor. Tom adjusted his glasses and lifted the first ledger with both hands, respectful as a deacon with the good hymnal. "Town records are fussy," he said, half apology and half pride. "We kept contractor ledgers long before anyone trusted computers to do it." Eve nodded. She had grease on one knuckle, a crescent she hadn't noticed until the yellow light found it. She placed her palms on the table, clean at the nails, careful at the edges, and watched Tom turn pages. Numbers marched in neat columns. Names appeared and left like trains. When he reached the section for parts orders, the paper changed from smooth to almost crisp. There, he said softly. He eased a gluey leaf apart and revealed a thin, yellowed carbon copy stub clinging to its twin. On it, in Eve's own square hand, a parts list, the vendor's name, the amount, the date. The night before the bus incident, the old one that had grown into gossip like a burr collects lint. Tom's finger traced the column of numerals. Your signature here. And look. He leaned closer, breath fogging his lenses. Shipment requested rush overnight. He smiled without moving his mouth much, as if saving the smile for later. People forget that paperwork can be an act of care. Eve didn't touch the stub yet. She felt the air change around it as if the room's center had slid an inch. The radiator knocked once decisively. The postmark will matter, Tom said, straightening. Carl will remember. He remembers everything with a date on it. He's got a calendar for a brain. Upstairs, the quiet of the stacks folded over them. Tom tucked the ledger into a manila folder the way you tuck a baby into a blanket. Let me walk it to the desk. You go find Carl before he runs his route. Seabrook's post office carried the day like a lunch pail sturdy sufficient. A line of townspeople curved around the bins of flat-rate boxes. Someone had set a travel mug of coffee by the scale steam feathering in the cool air each time the outer door opened. On the bulletin board near the entrance, holiday flyers layered over each other, coat drive, potluck wreath-making held in place by decades of enthusiastic thumbtacks. Carl stood at the counter, neat as always, in his blue shirt, a Santa necktie peeking out prematurely from his sweater vest. He was weighing a padded envelope with the concentration of a jeweler. Carl, Eve said when the line gave her to him, and he looked up with a smile that had never learned sarcasm. Ms. Harper, you're early for your usual bills, he teased. Must be a parts day. Tom's digging through ledgers. We think a parts order went out the night before the incident with Bus 7. I need a postmark match. Carl's eyes warmed with the pleasure of a puzzle. Night before. That was year before last cold snap came early. I remember because Mrs. Henley's cookies were still warm when she mailed them to her grandson and the chocolate smudged the customs form. He tapped the counter, thinking. Yes, you came in just before closing. Brown box, heavy for the size. You had that look like your mind was still under a hood while your body walked to my window. Eve felt the dimple of embarrassment and gratitude come together in her chest. I signed the form, and I stamped it. Carl said, pleased to be the other half of that equation. He strode to a low drawer and pulled a logbook like a magician producing scarves. Outgoing here. Vendor code. There. He slid the book around for Eve to see. The date sat quiet and sure on the page, the hour and minute pressed into ink by the stamp that had thumped 1,000 proofs of departure. Could you... Eve began and stopped because the word copy tasted like too much favor. I'll make you one, Carl said, already moving. And because it's nearly Thanksgiving, I'll do it on my lunch. He winked. Don't tell the union. Back on Main. The wind carried cinnamon from the bakery and pine from somewhere else. At the diner, the lunch hour was just beginning to gather its shape. Eve stepped in for a thermos fill and a breath between steps. The bell chimed, and June glanced up, saw the library dust still on Eve's sleeve, and reached for the pot. You look like you found something, June said, pouring with a gentleness that wasn't pity. She set a slice of apple pie beside the thermos without waiting for an answer. On the house. Keeps hands from shaking. At the corner booth, 2 men were talking louder than necessary. Records go missing when someone wants them to, one said, and didn't bother to lower his voice. I heard she cut corners that winter. Town got lucky. Coach Harris slid into the next booth with the unthinking ownership of a man who'd spent his adult life on gym bleachers. He nodded at Eve, friendly as always, but there was caution behind it. Folks are talking, he said, just to say a thing was true didn't mean he liked it. I'm sure you have your side. My side is the work, Eve said. Her tone wasn't sharp. It was a level line. Work's good, Coach allowed, but paper's how councils listen. He glanced toward the Civic Center as if he could see the hearing already. You know how it goes. June stepped in with the pie. At that moment, the plate held like a peace offering. She does, June said mildly, setting the fork where it would not clatter. And she knows how to eat pie, which is an advantage in any town worth living in. Her smile made the men at the corner buckle their lips around the rest of their words. Eve thanked her with a look that had weight. She took one bite she didn't taste and wrapped the rest to go with the efficiency of someone who never wastes what might later comfort. She crossed the street to St. Luke's. From the side yard came the crank shudder of a reluctant generator. Ray knelt beside it, sleeves pushed up a wrench in his hand that had been most recently used for apologies. Pastor Ruth stood near him, holding the owner's manual upside down and pleased to be there anyway. Sparks fouled, Ray said, not quite to himself. He worked with that quiet urgency people use when they're fixing something for someone else. In 3 minutes, the engine caught and straightened its breath. Ruth clapped her mittened hands. See a hymn of a machine when it remembers the tune. Ray wiped his palms on his coat with an absent motion and lifted his gaze long enough to meet Eve's. Respect moved between them like a nod they'd agreed on in a previous life. He went back to his work without waiting for praise. Evening put its hand on the town early. Eve climbed the steps to her small house, paint-chipped scars at the railing familiar under her palm. She sat on the porch swing and set it swaying with one foot. The radio in the kitchen played oldies low, the DJ reading names from a bake sale thank you list like a benediction. The wind had come around again. It brought the harbor's iodine and the faint damp of leaf mold, the long breath of a place preparing for winter. She opened the envelope Carl had copied and laid the paper beside the carbon stub Tom had sent over with a volunteer. The dates spoke to each other without effort. Her name the vendor, the parts each line was a rung on a ladder you could put weight on. In the distance, a train hooted once, then thought better of a second call. The swing creaked. Down on Harbor Road, a car door thumped and then quieted into the neighborhood knowing itself. Doubt against her had grown legs the past week running faster than a person could, but proof when it arrived had its own patience. It didn't shout. It stood and let the room adjust. Eve's hands were steady on the paper now. She could hear the men in the diner again, and Coach Harris trying to aim his fairness. She could see Carl's stamp and Tom's careful fingers, and Ray's wrench turning and June setting down a slice of pie like a vote in favor of mercy. The radiator in her own small house knocked a companionable sound. She wasn't alone in the way proof kept you company. She folded the stub carefully, knowing it will soon demand to be seen by everyone. The church hall smelled of waxed floors and potluck casseroles as folding chairs scraped into place beneath Veterans Day banners. Eve Harper sat near the back, her calloused hands folded in her lap, listening to the shuffle of townspeople settling in. The windows rattled faintly in the November wind, and from the adjoining room came the faint strains of a choir warming up a scale rising, stumbling, then catching itself again. Someone laughed at a missed note. The sound quickly hushed. Pastor Ruth brushed past Eve's shoulder, pausing to murmur, "There's a time to fix in silence, and a time to tell the truth." The words landed like a tool set gently on a bench, their weight waiting to be lifted. At the front of the hall, Gerald Blake adjusted his tie and laid out his folder with the precision of a man convinced of his own orderliness. He waited until the chairs stilled and then began. "Friends, our aim is simple," he said, voice crisp enough to slice bread. "Safe roads, safe buses. Unfortunately, the town garage has a record that suggests otherwise. Sloppy documentation, questionable maintenance, and failures that could have cost lives." His assistant set a clipboard on the lectern as though anchoring his points in ink. Murmurs shifted like wind through dry leaves. Eve felt each word settle in her chest, heavy as a socket wrench left in a pocket. Blake's gaze traveled the rows, finally landing on her with just enough pause to make it sting. She lowered her eyes to her wallet in her lap, fingers pressing its worn leather. For weeks she had folded it shut, as though keeping the world safe from what lived inside. Tonight the silence was heavier than the burden. Blake went on painting a picture of negligence with a brush dipped in careful insinuation. "Some garages cling to habit," he said, "but habit is not safety. And Ms. Harper's operation is proof of that." Eve felt her pulse rise to her ears. The faces of neighbors blurred June from the diner, Tom, the librarian, Coach Harris, Pastor Ruth, watching with patient steadiness. Behind the wall, the choir stumbled again, a child giggled, and the thin relief of ordinary life broke the tension for a breath. She stood. The chair legs grated against the floor, loud in the hush. Her knees trembled, but her voice came when she called it. "Enough." Heads turned. Blake paused, mid-page eyebrows arched. Eve opened her wallet. From its worn fold she drew the carbon copy receipt edges, browned by time ink still legible where her hand had pressed hard with a pen years ago. She held it up, the paper trembling only slightly. "This is the parts order placed the night before bus." 7 failed, she said, voice steadier now. "My name, the vendor, the rush shipment marked overnight." And here she stepped forward, placing it flat on the lectern beside Blake's folder, the postmark. Dated, stamped, logged. Tom Alvarez rose from his chair and came forward, spectacles sliding down his nose. He bent over the paper, nodded once, and turned to the crowd. "I found this in our records. It matches the logbook and Carl's stamp at the post office." A wave of murmurs moved across the hall, no longer suspicion, but surprise. People leaned to see eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in awe that proof had been hiding in plain sight. Coach Harris muttered, "She had it all along." June pressed her hands together as though she'd known, but had waited to hear it aloud. Blake's smile froze. "Paper," he said slowly, "can be misplaced, misinterpreted." "No," Tom cut in, voice stronger than his frame suggested. "This is exact. A copy pressed by pen and pressure. It cannot invent itself." The hall swelled with sound, neighbors whispering, some nodding, others sitting back with guilt at their earlier suspicions. For the first time in months, Eve felt air reach the bottom of her lungs. The silence she had carried cracked open, replaced by a fragile respect that spread across the rows like dawn across a field. Children from the choir peeked around the doorframe, giggling before a teacher shooed them back. The smell of coffee from the urns in back drifted forward, homely and grounding. Eve placed her hand lightly on the receipt, anchoring it in view, a small declaration that she would not tuck it away again. For a moment she believed the truth might be enough. Then Blake leaned forward, jaw tight, eyes narrowing as if the paper itself had challenged him. His voice dropped sharp and cutting. "Paper can be forged, Mrs. Harper." The hall erupted in whispers that grew into angry voices like surf crashing against rocks. The receipt still lay on the lectern, Tom Alvarez's finger steadying it as though truth itself might slip if he let go. Gerald Blake shook his head, lips pulled thin. "Convenient paper doesn't erase years of sloppy work," he said. "And even if it did this, town has larger problems than one woman's misplaced pride." The crowd bristled. Someone hissed. June from the diner rose from her chair, voice carrying clear, "I saw her that night, lights burning in the garage after everyone else went home. She was mailing those parts when the rest of us were thinking about pie." A low rumble of agreement followed. Then the security guard at the back, still in his shiny jacket, barked a laugh. He jabbed a finger toward Ray Donovan, who sat near the wall with his duffel tucked under his chair. "And what about him? Your star witness. Man sleeps on benches. You'll believe him before an officer of the company." Ray did not answer. His eyes stayed on the floorboards, shoulders curled in the shape of weather endured. The guards' laughter scraped the air. The townspeople's voices rose sharp with outrage. A woman shouted, "Enough!" Others joined the sound, crashing in waves, chairs creaking as people stood. Blake raised his hand for order, but no one looked at him. Pastor Ruth stepped forward, her presence steady as a plumb line. She raised both palms. Quiet now, she said, not loud, but sure. Slowly the voices ebbed, leaving the air tight with waiting. Ruth touched the receipt once, then lifted her gaze. This is not about one sheet of paper. It's about whether we recognize the care given in silence. She looked toward Ray. And whether we dismiss a man because his coat is worn. From the second row, Mr. Wallace, a retired bus driver with hair like white wire, rose and pulled something from his wallet, an old laminated bus pass, corners frayed. He walked it forward and laid it beside Eve's receipt. "She kept us safe," he said simply. A hush deepened. Then Lily, the schoolgirl whose mother sang alto in the choir, stepped forward, clutching a slip of notebook paper with a child's drawing of a bus. She placed it on the lectern with shy fingers. "She fixed it so we didn't miss Christmas pageant," she whispered. Others followed. A woman placed a photo of her father in uniform. A man set down his service cap. Each item joined the growing small altar of memory beside the receipt. One by one, the townspeople stood, hands pressed over their hearts, a gesture as old as pledge and as fresh as conscience. From the side room, the children's choir, sensing the weight in the hall, began humming softly. Their uneven voices drifted into harmony, a hymn without words that filled the space with calm. The smell of pine from newly hung wreaths mixed with the sharper scent of coffee still hot in urns at the back. Outside engines rumbled on Harbor Road, low, disciplined, unmistakable. Heads turned toward the windows. A convoy of Navy vehicles rolled slowly past headlights, cutting gold into the November dusk. At their center rode Admiral Cole, the same officer whose commands once depended on Ray Donovan's hands. The convoy stopped. Boots struck pavement. The hall doors opened, letting in cold air and authority in equal measure. Admiral Cole stepped inside, cap tucked under his arm, eyes sweeping the crowd before resting on Ray. This man Cole, said voice, resonant with sea and salt, kept sailors alive when storms wanted us gone. He crossed to Ray and set a hand firmly on his shoulder. The room exhaled as one. Eve, standing a few feet away, felt her knees steady for the first time all evening. The items on the lectern receipt bus pass child's drawing shone under the fluorescent lights like proof stitched together by a community's own hands. And yet Blake's jaw was set, his eyes darting the receipt before him, now heavier than he'd planned. Admiral Cole's words lingered in the hush, the decision spoken aloud for all to hear. This man kept sailors alive when storms wanted us gone. By Thanksgiving week, Seabrook's main street glowed with early Christmas lights strung between lampposts. Morning laid a pale ribbon across the harbor, and the diner windows caught it turning steam on the glass into soft halos. Oldies hummed from the counter radio. A DJ read out names of families dropping pies at the church hall, each name spoken like a blessing, stitched to crust and spice. June moved between booths with the grace of someone who knows where every cup belongs before it's asked for. When Eve came in, June reached the pot without thinking and poured same hand, same mug, but the tilt of her head had changed. Respect lived there now, unannounced and unmistakable. Holiday rush. June said, cheerful and calm, setting a second mug at the corner for later, as if she believed in good surprises. "You see the wreaths yet? Town manager says they're the best we've had in years. They smell like the woods," Eve said. From the street, a puff of pine followed a family shouldering a fresh wreath through the door needles sparkling with frost. A couple of children laughed at their own breath hopping from tile to tile as if the floor were a secret map. Townsfolk talked pie and schedules and who had a seat to spare at their table. No one brought up hearings, but the knowledge sat companionably among them like a coat draped over a chair there if you reached for it, otherwise content to wait. The council's vote had come the night before the bus garage to remain under town policy, with support pledged by volunteers and a line in the budget for proper upgrades. It wasn't dramatic. It was decisive. The kind of yes that fit Seabrook firm without fanfare. Eve finished her eggs, left a tip that made June give her a mock scold, and stepped into the brittle air. At the garage, she and 2 high school shop students, faces pink from the cold confidence rattling their tools, helped mount a freshly laminated sheet beside the pegboard. Harper Safety Checklist. The header said in block letters Tom had printed at the library torque. Specs. Bleed order sign-offs a place for names that would carry the work forward. Looks like a contract with the future, one of the boys said, proud, in a way that made Eve want to put a coat over every kid in town. It is, she answered, handing him the pen. Write yours on the bottom. First one today. He printed carefully, then stepped back to admire his name with the respect usually saved for trophies. In the bay, the town bus waited for its oil change patient as a horse that knows its rider. Before lunch, Eve crossed to the library for the small unveiling Pastor Ruth had refused to call a ceremony. An alcove near the front desk had been cleared and painted a warmer white. On its shelf, polished wood that still smelled faintly of varnish, sat the display Tom and June and half the town had conspired into being. A clean copy of the carbon receipt under glass. The ink, dark as fresh resolve. Beside it, Mr. Wallace's frayed bus, past the lamination, bubbled at one corner as if eager to talk. Between them, a photograph of Ray in his younger days, whined, standing his hair on end, a grin halfway to a laugh, the sea behind him shouldering the horizon. A small card read, Tools of Quiet Hands. Below a line in Tom's careful script, Work done right is a kind of love. The alcove gathered people as light gathers dust. Lily from the choir tugged her mother's sleeve to show where she'd tucked her drawing of the bus, now mounted with clear corners. A pair of retirees stood with heads bent together reading aloud the checklist Eve had helped write for shop class. Conversation moved at the slow, satisfied pace of folks who had put their backs into something and found it steady underfoot. Ray came in hat in hand out of habit coat newly mended where a sleeve had frayed. He hovered at the door the way a person does when he's not sure grace extends far enough to include him, then caught sight of the photo and stopped. The years seemed to fold at the edges of his face. You look like you just heard a joke, Eve said, stepping to his side. Maybe I did, he answered, and his eyes watered the way eyes do when wind and memory trade places. Pastor Ruth slid an arm through his without asking. Tom handed him a small brass plaque, the sort you can screw into wood without first asking history's permission. Ray turned it once in his palm and then fastened it beneath the photo with slow, careful turns, the screwdriver biting true. When he finished, he set the tool down with a reverence that had nothing to do with churches and everything to do with work. Afternoon pushed on. At St. Luke's, the potluck tables went up in a practiced choreography tablecloths smoothed by hands that had learned to spread generosity without wasting a corner. The coat drive box had overflowed by noon. 2 teenagers ferried armloads to the back and returned for more. Someone tuned a guitar. The children rehearsed their pageant lines in whispers that weren't whispers at all. Eve helped lift a roaster pan onto the warmer and accepted a paper cup of cider that steamed up her glasses. Ray hovered near the door until Lily thrust a roll into his hand like an assignment. The roll went quickly, the second one slower as conversations began to find him. Mr. Wallace told a bus story that ended in laughter, the kind that makes you lean in rather than back. Pastor Ruth clapped time to a hymn that decided to start itself. When dusk fell, the hall's windows turned to mirrors, and the wreaths on the glass became crowns. Out on Harbor Road, engines sounded low and even familiar now, a cadence the town had learned to hear as assurance, rather than interruption. The convoy rolled by at a respectful crawl, headlights sliding along the church's brick. No one stood at attention. No one made a flourish. But when the horns dipped in a soft salute, everyone heard it, as if the sound had chosen a seat at their table. Eve and Ray stepped outside for a breath of cold between courses. The air was sharp and clean, pine and pie and a hint of sea braided together like a ribbon through the night. Down the block, June locked the diner door a minute early so she could carry a tray of pumpkin bars across the street without missing the amen. She caught Eve's eye, lifted the tray, and laughed at something Eve didn't need to hear to understand. Back inside, the library display waited in its pool of lamplight. The checklist on the garage wall waited to be signed again tomorrow. The coat box waited to be emptied and filled and emptied again. Waiting in Seabrook had turned into doing. Doing had turned into a kind of quiet promise. Eve and Ray found the long table by the windows. The room's low talk rose and fell like a tide, obedient to the moon's old logic. Admiral Cole wasn't there, hadn't needed to be, but the echo of his hand on Ray's shoulder had done its work, and then moved aside so the town could do the rest. June made her rounds one more time out of habit and delight, and when she reached Eve, she poured the last of the coffee without asking, then tipped the pot toward Ray with a teasing flourish that said, "You too now." Children ran a giggling relay to the dessert table. An older couple argued tenderly over whether to take home an extra slice for breakfast and decided that yes, life was short and cinnamon was long. Eve curled her fingers around the mug and let the heat travel. Beyond the window, the lights along Main blinked once, as if agreeing with something only they knew. Steam curled from Eve's mug. Silence around her now felt like respect, not suspicion. Steam curled from mugs in the diner, and children's laughter drifted through the church hall, carrying Seabrook into a peace that felt earned, not borrowed. The old receipt, once hidden in Eve's wallet, now sat beneath glass at the library. No longer a secret defense, but a shared reminder, while townsfolk moved with a gentler rhythm, refilling coffee, tipping heavy, offering coats until the box overflowed. What began with suspicion and harsh words had been overturned by one woman's steady courage and the community's outrage blossoming into justice, leaving behind a warmth as steady as the hymn that rose from the choir. In the end, Seabrook learned that kindness given quietly holds more weight than any accusation, and that worn jackets or tired hands can conceal the strongest acts of care. Like a lamp left glowing in a winter window, a single gesture of mercy can steady a whole town through its longest nights. So the checklist on the garage wall, the alcove of quiet hands in the library, and the convoy's respectful horn became more than symbols, they became habits. And if this story lingers, it may be because every neighbor carries the chance to place down their own quiet kindness where it can be found.